They say fear has many faces, but I never truly understood terror until I watched a human mother cradle her dying child while simultaneously reloading a plasma rifle with one hand. That was the moment I realized we had been asking the wrong question all along. We spent decades wondering if humans were intelligent enough to join the Galactic Federation. We should have been asking if we were brave enough to stand beside them. My name is Zektar, and I am a Valorian warrior scholar from the third moon of Kepler, 442b. For 12 cycles, I served as a military observer, cataloging the combat effectiveness of various species across 17 different war zones. I had witnessed the methodical precision of the Krathan death squads, survived the berserker fury of the Bloodmane clans, and even observed the terrifying hive mind coordination of the Zerg swarms. Nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I would witness when humanity entered their first galactic war. This is not a story about human victory. Victory can be achieved through superior technology, favorable terrain, or simple numerical advantage. This is a story about something far more disturbing and beautiful. The moment an entire galaxy realized that humans don't just fight wars, they become the war itself. What follows is my testimony, recorded in the aftermath of the Battle of Zerion Prime. When I finally understood why every ancient civilization that had encountered humans either worshipped them as gods or fled to the farthest reaches of the galaxy. Sometimes, the most terrifying thing isn't the monster in the dark. Sometimes it's discovering that the monster has been fighting beside you all along, and it's been holding back. The transport ship Meridian's Grace shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace, and Zektar felt his stomach lurch against his ribs. Even after 12 cycles of military service, he still hadn't grown accustomed to the violent transition between dimensions. Through the viewports, the blue-white star of the Zerion system blazed against the cosmic void, its light revealing the skeletal remains of what had once been a thriving trade route. Debris fields stretched for millions of kilometers in every direction. The twisted hulks of merchant vessels, their cargo holds split open like overripe fruit, drifted alongside the more angular remains of military cruisers. Zektar's compound eyes adjusted automatically to the stark contrasts of light and shadow, cataloguing the destruction with the practiced efficiency of a warrior scholar. First time seeing a Draktari hunting ground? The voice belonged to Commander Velnara, a seasoned Krathan whose chitinous armor bore the scars of a dozen campaigns. She moved with the careful precision of a predator, each step calculated and purposeful. Zektar nodded, his throat pouch fluttering with nervous energy. The intelligence reports mentioned extensive raiding, but this... He gestured at the viewport with one of his forearms. This suggests systematic annihilation. The Draktari don't raid, Velnara corrected, her mandibles clicking with what might have been amusement. They consume. Every ship you see out there was stripped of biological matter before being discarded. The crews, she let the sentence hang in the recycled air. The Draktari hegemony had emerged from the galactic rim 18 standard months ago, sweeping through outer systems like a plague of living shadow. Their ships were grown rather than built, pulsing biomechanical nightmares that could repair themselves by consuming enemy vessels. Worse still, they had developed a taste for sentient flesh, treating intelligent species as nothing more than mobile protein sources. The Galactic Federation's response had been swift but inadequate. Traditional warfare proved useless against an enemy that could literally digest your weapons and use them to strengthen their own forces. 3 task forces had already been lost to the Draktari advance, their crews adding to the enemy's biological reserves, which was why the Federation had finally done something unprecedented. They had asked for help from the humans. Zektar had studied the human files extensively during the journey to Zerion. Homo sapiens, native to a death world called Earth in a relatively unremarkable star system. They had achieved faster-than-light travel only 2 centuries ago, and had spent most of that time fighting among themselves. Their technology was crude by galactic standards, their society fragmented, and their lifespans laughably brief. What made them interesting was their military record. In the 200 years since achieving interstellar flight, humans had fought in over 300 separate conflicts. They had served as mercenaries, advisors, shock troops, and specialists in dozens of different armies. Their casualty rates were astronomical, their equipment frequently obsolete, and their tactical doctrine seemed to consist primarily of variations on the theme of charge directly at the enemy while screaming. Yet somehow, they kept winning. Observer Zektar, report to Briefing Room 7. The ship's communication system crackled with typical Krathan efficiency. Zektar gathered his data tablets and made his way through the transport's narrow corridors, passing other Federation observers, military attachés, and the occasional diplomat. The air hummed with nervous energy and barely controlled fear. Briefing Room 7 was larger than he had expected. with holographic displays showing real-time intelligence data from the Xerion system. Around the central table sat representatives from a dozen different species. Krathan military analysts with their gleaming carapaces, ethereal Zephyrians whose gossamer forms seemed to drift despite the artificial gravity, stocky Valorians like himself, and others he recognized from his extensive xenological studies. At the head of the table stood a human. Zektar had seen humans in holovids and static images, but encountering one in person was surprisingly unsettling. The being was smaller than he had expected, barely reaching Zektar's thorax even when standing upright. Its skin was a pale brown color, marked with what appeared to be ritual scarification along the arms and neck. Most disturbing were the eyes, small, forward-facing, and utterly alien in their intensity. "Ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished beings," the human said, its voice carrying easily through the room despite its modest size. "I'm Colonel Sarah Chen, Human Expeditionary Force. I'll be coordinating the defense of Xerion Prime." A Krathan general named Tarkmor rose from his seat, his massive frame dwarfing the human. "With respect, Colonel, the Federation has already committed substantial resources to this system. Perhaps it would be more efficient to coordinate through existing command structures." The human's mouth curved in what Zektar recognized as a smile, though the expression seemed to contain more teeth than strictly necessary. "General Thakmor, I've reviewed your previous engagements with the Draktari, 3 separate task forces, each one following standard Federation doctrine. How did that work out?" The room fell silent. Takmor's mandibles worked soundlessly for several seconds before he settled back into his chair. "The Draktari are not like previous enemies," Colonel Chen continued, activating a holographic display that showed the approaching enemy fleet. "They don't fight wars, they farm them. Every ship they destroy, every soldier they kill, every civilian they consume makes them stronger. Traditional military doctrine is not just useless against them, it's actively counterproductive." The display shifted, showing detailed scans of Draktari vessels. The ships were grotesque amalgamations of metal and flesh, their hulls pulsing with organic rhythms. Feeding tentacles extended from their weapon ports, and Zektar could see smaller craft, digester ships, swarming around the larger vessels like parasitic fish. Intelligence estimates put their fleet strength at approximately 400 vessels, including 12 hive mothers, Chen said. "They'll reach Xerion Prime in 72 standard hours." The planet's population is currently 3.7 billion beings across 47 different species. A Zephyrian delegate named Whisper of Wind flowed forward slightly. "Colonel, what do the humans propose? Your species has extensive combat experience, but nothing on this scale." The human's smile widened, and Zektar felt an involuntary shudder run through his exoskeleton. There was something predatory in that expression, something that triggered ancient prey responses he hadn't known he possessed. "We're going to teach them the difference between hunting and being hunted," Chen said simply. Over the next 2 hours, Colonel Chen outlined the human battle plan. It was, by any reasonable standard, completely insane. Instead of establishing defensive positions around Xerion Prime, the humans intended to meet the Draktari fleet at the edge of the system. Rather than concentrating their forces, they planned to scatter across multiple vectors. Most disturbing of all, they seemed actively eager to engage in close-quarters combat with an enemy that literally ate other starships. "The key to understanding Draktari tactics," Chen explained, "is recognizing that they're not really warriors. They're predators. Predators are efficient, calculating, and risk-averse. They attack weak targets and avoid strong ones. They retreat when threatened and advance when they sense vulnerability." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the assembled observers. "Humans are not predators," she said quietly. "We're persistence hunters. We don't chase the weak, we chase the strong until they collapse from exhaustion. We don't avoid risk, we weaponize it. And we don't retreat when threatened." Her smile returned, sharper than before. "We get angry." The briefing concluded with assignment details. Zektar found himself assigned to observe human combat operations aboard the destroyer Relentless, along with military attachés from 6 other Federation species. As the observers filed out of the briefing room, he overheard fragments of conversation in a dozen different languages. The consensus seemed to be that the humans were either brilliantly innovative or suicidally insane. Possibly both. The shuttle ride to the Relentless gave Zektar his first close look at human military technology. The ship was smaller than comparable Federation vessels, with angular lines and an aggressive profile that seemed designed more for ramming than ranged combat. Its hull was scarred with impact marks and burn patterns, giving it the appearance of a weapon that had been used extensively and repaired repeatedly. The interior was even more unsettling. Where Federation ships prioritized efficiency and comfort, human vessels seemed designed for function above all else. The corridors were narrow and cramped, the lighting harsh and utilitarian. Everything that could be reinforced had been reinforced, and everything that couldn't be reinforced had been made replaceable. Zektar's quarters were a small cabin with a fold-out bunk, a basic sanitation unit, and a porthole that looked out onto the ship's weapon arrays. As he settled in to review his observation protocols, he became aware of a rhythmic vibration running through the ship's hull. It took him several minutes to identify the source. Hundreds of human crew members moving through their duties with mechanical precision. The humans aboard the Relentless were unlike any soldiers he had previously observed. They moved with a controlled efficiency that reminded him of the Krathan death squads, but there was something else, an undercurrent of barely contained violence that seemed to permeate every interaction. When they spoke to each other, it was in short, clipped sentences. When they moved, it was with the careful economy of motion he associated with predators. But the most disturbing thing about the human crew was their apparent lack of fear. In every military unit Zektar had observed, there was always an undercurrent of anxiety before combat. Soldiers checked their equipment obsessively, formed small groups for emotional support, or engaged in rituals designed to ward off death. The humans did none of these things. They simply went about their duties with the same calm efficiency they might display while preparing for routine maneuvers. As the Relentless moved into position at the edge of the Xerian system, Zektar found himself on the observation deck with the other Federation attachés. Through the reinforced transparisteel, he could see the human fleet taking shape. 47 ships ranging from massive battlecruisers to tiny corvettes, all moving in a complex pattern that seemed chaotic until you realized it was designed to confuse enemy targeting systems. "Sensors are picking up the Drakhtari Advance Fleet," announced Lieutenant Torres, the human officer assigned to keep the observers informed. She was young even by human standards, probably no more than 25 standard years, but she carried herself with the confidence of a veteran. ETA 18 hours. A Zephyrian observer named Song of Sorrow flowed closer to the display screens. "Lieutenant, your fleet appears to be dispersing rather than concentrating. Is this intentional?" Torres nodded. "Standard human doctrine against hive mind opponents. Make them split their attention across multiple targets. Force them to make decisions faster than their communication systems can handle. But that will leave individual ships vulnerable to concentrated attack," protested Yargov, a Valorian military analyst. The Drakhtari prefer to swarm isolated targets. The human's expression shifted slightly, and Zektar realized she was trying not to smile. "Sir, with respect, that's exactly what we're counting on." As night fell aboard the Relentless, or what passed for night in the artificial environment of a starship, Zektar made his way to the observation lounge. The room was empty except for a single human sitting by the large viewport, staring out at the stars. She was older than most of the crew, with grey streaking through her dark hair, and lines around her eyes that spoke of long years and hard choices. "Mind if I join you?" Zektar asked, his translator rendering his clicks and whistles into standard Federation common. The human glanced up and nodded toward an empty chair. "Sure, can't sleep either." Zektar settled into the chair, his forearms arranging themselves comfortably. "I confess, I find the human approach to warfare puzzling. In my experience, successful military doctrine emphasizes preservation of force and minimization of casualties." "Makes sense," the human replied. "Most species fight wars to achieve objectives. Territory, resources, political goals. You want to win with the minimum cost to yourself." "And humans fight differently?" The woman was quiet for a long moment, her eyes focused on something beyond the stars. "We don't fight wars to achieve objectives," she said finally. "We fight wars to end them. Sometimes that means winning fast and dirty rather than slow and clean." She turned to look at him directly, and Zektar felt that familiar predatory chill. "What's your name, friend?" "Zektar of the 3rd Valorian Science Expedition. I am a warrior scholar, assigned to observe and catalogue human military capabilities." "I'm Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos," she replied. 23 years in the Human Defense Force, 12 years fighting alien wars. She gestured toward the viewport. "Want to know what I've learned in all that time?" Zektar nodded, his throat pouch fluttering with curiosity. "Most species in this galaxy are civilized," Santos said. "They have rules about warfare, codes of conduct, limits they won't cross. They fight wars the way you might play a game, with structure, strategy, and an understanding that there are certain moves you simply don't make. She leaned back in her chair, her expression growing distant. Humans aren't civilized, Zektar. We're domesticated. And there's a big difference between the two. Before Zektar could ask what she meant, the ship's alert system activated. Red lights began flashing in the corridors, and the steady hum of the engines shifted to a higher, more urgent frequency. "All hands to battle stations," came the announcement. "Traktari fleet detected at system perimeter. Engagement in T-minus 47 minutes." Santos stood and stretched, her movements casual, despite the approaching battle. "Looks like you're about to get that demonstration after all." As she walked away, Zektar remained by the viewport, watching as the human fleet began its final approach toward an enemy that had consumed 3 previous task forces. In the distance, he could see the first faint glimmers of light that marked the Draktari advanced scouts. For the first time in his military career, Zektar found himself wondering if he was about to witness a massacre. He just wasn't sure who would be doing the massacring. The first thing Zektar noticed about human combat was the sound. Every species he had observed in battle had its own acoustic signature. Krathan warriors clicked and hissed as they coordinated attacks, their mandibles creating complex harmonics that conveyed tactical information. Zephyrians sang haunting melodies that seemed to flow directly into the minds of their allies, while Valorian war cries could be heard across entire battlefields, designed to inspire courage and strike fear into enemy hearts. Humans fought in near silence. Standing on the observation deck of the Relentless, Zektar watched through the tactical displays as the human fleet closed with the Draktari advance force. The enemy ships were exactly as grotesque as the intelligence reports had suggested. Writhing masses of biomechanical horror that pulsed with organic rhythms and bristled with feeding tentacles. Some were the size of small moons, their hulls covered in what appeared to be sensory organs and digestive chambers. "Contact in 30 seconds, announced Lieutenant Torres, her voice calm and professional. Around the bridge, human crew members moved with mechanical precision, their faces showing no emotion beyond focused concentration. No war cries, no ritual challenges, no last-minute prayers to vengeful gods. They simply prepared to kill. The Draktari opened fire first, launching clouds of bioprojectiles that moved like living things through the void. The weapons were part missile, part creature, seeking targets with predatory intelligence while adapting to defensive countermeasures in real time. Zektar had seen footage of these weapons consuming entire Federation cruisers, their corrosive payloads eating through hull plating before depositing boarding parties directly into the enemy ship's vital systems. The human response was immediate and utterly ruthless. Instead of trying to intercept the bioprojectiles, the human ships accelerated directly toward them. Point defense systems opened fire with weapons Zektar didn't recognize. Not energy beams or kinetic projectiles, but some kind of exotic particles that seemed to cause the bioweapons to simply cease functioning. The creatures writhed and died in space, their life functions terminating so quickly that their guidance systems couldn't compensate. "Temporal disruptors," Taurus explained, noticing Zektar's confusion. "They accelerate localized time flow. Organic systems age decades in milliseconds." "That's?" Zektar's throat pouch fluttered with shock. "That technology is banned under 17 different galactic conventions. The Temporal Research Accords alone." "We're not signatories to the Temporal Research Accords," Taurus replied without taking her eyes off her tactical display. "Neither are the Draktari. The first human ship to reach effective weapons range was a corvette called Spite. Against any sane tactical doctrine, it dove directly into the center of the enemy formation, its hull barely larger than some of the Draktari weapons. Zektar expected to see it consumed within seconds, torn apart by the superior firepower of the enemy fleet. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The Spite began moving in a pattern that defied every principle of space combat Zektar had ever learned. Instead of maintaining distance and using its superior speed to avoid enemy fire, it moved closer to the Draktari ships, weaving between their weapon systems with impossible precision. When the enemy tried to bring their main guns to bear, they found themselves targeting their own vessels. When they attempted to deploy boarding parties, the human ship would dance away, leaving the bio-soldiers stranded in vacuum. "Knife fighting," Taurus said, noting Zektar's amazement. "Captain Morrison learned it fighting pirates in the Tau Ceti system. You get in so close that the enemy can't use their big guns without hitting themselves." But the Spite wasn't just avoiding enemy fire. Every few seconds, It would align itself with a specific angle relative to one of the larger Drakhtari vessels, and its primary weapon would discharge. The energy beam that emerged was unlike anything in the Federation arsenal. A crackling lance of what appeared to be pure entropy that didn't just destroy its targets, but unraveled them at the molecular level. Null field projector, Taurus explained. It reduces the strong nuclear force in the target area. Matter just stops holding together. Zektar felt his exoskeleton crawling with horror. These weapons, they violate fundamental principles of warfare. The collateral damage alone only works in vacuum, Torres said calmly, and only on artificial materials. Organic compounds are naturally resistant. She paused, checking her instruments. Though that's not why we use them. Then why? Torres finally looked at him, and Zektar saw something in her eyes that made his prey instincts scream warnings. Because they scare the hell out of anything smart enough to understand what they do. On the tactical display, more human ships were engaging the enemy. Each vessel seemed to have its own specialized approach to combat, as if the entire fleet had been designed not for coordinated warfare, but for individual acts of controlled violence. A destroyer called Vindictive was using some kind of gravitic weapon to create artificial black holes that consumed Drakhtari bioships from the inside out. The cruiser Implacable had deployed weapons that seemed to age enemy vessels into dust and debris, while the battleship Inevitable was firing projectiles that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, making conventional armor utterly useless. But the most disturbing thing wasn't the weapons themselves, it was how the humans used them. Every Federation military doctrine Zektar had studied emphasized the importance of preserving one's own forces while achieving objectives with minimal collateral damage. The humans seemed to operate on a completely different principle, maximum violence applied with surgical precision. They didn't just want to defeat the Drakhtari, they wanted to demonstrate exactly how thoroughly they could be destroyed. Incoming transmission from Drakhtari command vessel, announced the communications officer. They're requesting parley. Lieutenant Torres glanced toward the captain, a grizzled woman named Rodriguez whose uniform bore the scars of what looked like acid damage. The captain studied her tactical displays for several seconds before responding. Put them through.
The main screen shifted to show the interior of a Drakhtari command ship.
The being that appeared was a nightmare amalgamation of insect and crustacean, its multiple eyes gleaming with predatory intelligence. When it spoke, its voice was translated into Federation standard by the ship's linguistic computers. Human vessels. This is Hive Master Vektash of the 9th Consumption Fleet. You fight with weapons that violate the natural order. We propose temporary cessation of hostilities while we negotiate terms of engagement. Captain Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, her eyes never leaving the alien creature on the screen. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that seemed to press against Zektar's consciousness. Hive Master Vektash, this is Captain Elena Rodriguez of the Human Expeditionary Force. You've consumed 3 billion sentient beings in the past 18 months. You've turned their children into food and their homes into hunting grounds. She leaned forward slightly. There are no terms of engagement. There is only what happens next. The Drakhtari creature's mandibles clicked with what might have been confusion. You speak as if this conflict has personal meaning for your species. We have no quarrel with humanity specifically. Our actions are driven by biological necessity, not malice. Rodriguez's expression didn't change. That's the problem. You think of sentient beings as resources to be consumed. We think of them as people to be protected. She paused, and we take that very personally. Surely rational beings can reach some accommodation. We're not rational beings, Rodriguez interrupted. We're humans, and you just made the mistake of threatening something we care about. Her smile was purely predatory. Now you get to learn why the Federation called us for help. The transmission ended abruptly, and Captain Rodriguez turned to address her bridge crew. All ships, weapons free. No survivors, no prisoners, no quarter. These things eat children. Her voice carried throughout the ship's communication system. Show them why that was a mistake. What happened next would remain burned into Zektar's memory for the rest of his natural life. The human fleet didn't just attack the Drakhtari, they systematically dismantled them. Every ship, every weapon system, every biomechanical horror that the enemy had created was methodically identified, targeted, and destroyed with weapons that seemed to violate the fundamental laws of physics. But the truly terrifying part wasn't the technology. It was the emotion behind it. Zektar had witnessed dozens of different species in combat, and he thought he understood the psychology of warfare. Soldiers fought out of duty, loyalty, fear, or the simple desire to survive. Professional armies were motivated by discipline and training. Even berserkers and fanatics operated according to predictable patterns. The humans were fighting out of anger. Not the hot, irrational fury of a wounded animal, but the cold, calculating wrath of a species that had decided to make an example of someone. Every weapon discharge was precise, every maneuver deliberate, every target selection based on achieving maximum psychological impact on the surviving enemy forces. "They're trying to retreat," Torres announced, monitoring the tactical situation. Several Draktari vessels had broken off from the main engagement and were accelerating toward the system's edge, clearly hoping to escape back to hyperspace. "Pursuit course," Captain Rodriguez ordered. "Don't let any of them get away." Yargoth, the Valorian military analyst, moved closer to Zektar. "This is unprecedented," he whispered, his voice filled with awe and horror. "They're not fighting to achieve victory. They're fighting to send a message." On the tactical display, the human ships were indeed pursuing the fleeing Draktari with relentless efficiency. The enemy vessels were faster in straight-line acceleration, but the humans seemed to anticipate their every move, cutting off escape routes and herding the aliens back toward the main engagement. It was like watching predators drive prey toward a killing ground. The last Draktari ship to die was one of their massive hive mothers, a creature vessel the size of a small asteroid that should have been capable of destroying the entire human fleet through sheer mass alone. Instead, the humans had systematically stripped away its defenses, disabled its weapons, and left it helpless in space. Captain Rodriguez opened a communication channel to the dying ship. "Hive Mother, this is Captain Rodriguez. You wanted to negotiate terms of engagement. Here are our terms. Leave this galaxy and never come back. Tell every Draktari fleet commander, every hive master, every consumption squad leader exactly what happened here today. Tell them that if they threaten any Federation world, any Federation citizen, or any Federation child ever again, we will find them. And when we do, what happened here will look like mercy." She paused, letting the words sink in. "We are humans, and we have made a decision about you. Pass it on." The null field projectors fired one final time, and the Hive Mother dissolved into its component atoms. In the aftermath, as the human fleet regrouped and began search and rescue operations for any surviving Federation personnel from earlier battles, Zektar found himself alone on the observation deck. His forearms were trembling, and his throat pouch kept contracting involuntarily. In all his years as a warrior scholar, he had never witnessed anything like what he had just seen. Chief Petty Officer Santos appeared beside him, her expression thoughtful as she gazed out at the debris field that had once been a Draktari fleet. "You asked me earlier about the difference between civilized and domesticated," she said quietly. "Civilized species create rules to govern their behavior. They develop codes of conduct, laws of war, principles that limit how much damage they're willing to do." She gestured toward the wreckage floating outside. "Domesticated species learn to control themselves because they know what they're capable of if they don't." Zektar's translator struggled with the emotional undertones in her voice. "And humans are domesticated?" Santos nodded slowly. "We spent 300,000 years learning how to kill everything on our planet. Then we spent the last 10,000 years learning how to live with each other without destroying ourselves. It's a very thin layer of civilization, Zektar, and it only works because everyone understands what happens when it fails." She turned to look at him directly, and he saw something in her eyes that made him understand why the Draktari had tried to negotiate rather than fight. "The thing about humans," Santos said, "is that we don't actually want to be monsters. We want to be the good guys, to protect people and build things and make the galaxy a better place. But when something threatens what we care about," she shrugged, "well, you just saw what happens when we decide we don't have a choice." As the Relentless began its journey back towards Zerion Prime, Zektar compiled his initial report on human military capabilities. But no matter how he tried to phrase it, he couldn't capture what he had really witnessed. The weapons were impressive, certainly, and the tactical doctrine was revolutionary. But what truly terrified him wasn't the humans' ability to wage war. It was their ability to choose when to stop, and their willingness to choose not to. 3 days after the destruction of the Draktari advance fleet, Zektar found himself in the most unlikely place he could have imagined, a human field hospital on the surface of Zerion Prime. The planet was a garden world, its rolling hills covered in crystalline forests that sang in harmonics when the wind moved through their branches. The native Zerions were a peaceful species, evolved from herbivorous pack animals whose greatest achievement had been the development of a complex musical language that could convey emotional states across vast distances. They had never developed weapons more sophisticated than farming tools, which made them ideal targets for the Drakhtari consumption fleets. Now their world had become a fortress. Human engineering teams had transformed the pastoral landscape into something that looked like the result of a nightmare fever dream. Defensive positions had been carved into the living rock with weapons that seemed to reshape matter at the atomic level. Artillery emplacements rose from the crystal forest like mechanical flowers, their targeting systems integrated with the planet's natural resonance fields to create a detection network that could track movement across entire continents. But it was the humans themselves that proved most unsettling. Zektar had expected to find soldiers still riding the adrenaline high of their recent victory, perhaps celebrating their triumph over the Drakhtari advance force. Instead, he discovered men and women who moved with the mechanical efficiency of beings preparing for something far worse than what they had already faced. The advance fleet was just a scouting force, explained Colonel Chen as she led Zektar and the other Federation observers through the hastily constructed command center. Intelligence estimates put the main Drakhtari armada at over 2,000 vessels, including 47 hive mothers. They'll arrive within the week. Dr. Yeshvara, a Zephyrian xenopsychologist whose gossamer form seemed to flicker with nervous energy, flowed closer to the tactical displays. Colonel, surely the destruction of their advance force will cause them to reconsider their approach? Predator species typically avoid confrontations when faced with unexpected resistance. The human's expression shifted in a way that Zektar was beginning to recognize as distinctly dangerous. Doctor, you're making the same mistake everyone else makes when dealing with humans. You're assuming the Drakhtari think like predators. She gestured toward the holographic display showing the incoming enemy fleet. They don't. They think like parasites. The distinction took Zektar a moment to process. Parasites adapt to overcome host defenses rather than seeking easier targets? Exactly. And their adaptation cycle is much faster than anyone anticipated. Colonel Chen activated a series of recordings taken from the previous battle. Analysis of the wreckage shows they were already modifying their bioships based on our weapon signatures. If we fought them again tomorrow using the same tactics, we'd probably lose. The recordings showed Drakhtari vessels in various stages of dissolution, but even as they died, Zektar could see their hulls attempting to adapt. Organic armor was shifting density and composition, weapon systems were reconfiguring themselves, and in some cases damaged ships were actually trying to incorporate the exotic energies that were destroying them. So what's the plan? Asked Commander Velnara, her Krathan pragmatism cutting through the growing tension in the room. Colonel Chen's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. We're going to teach them why humans don't just fight wars. We fight genocides. The next several hours were spent reviewing the human defensive plan, and Zektar found himself growing increasingly disturbed by what he heard. The humans weren't just preparing to defend Zirian Prime, they were preparing to use the planet as bait in a trap designed to destroy the entire Drakhtari armada. The native population had been evacuated to underground cities that had been carved from solid rock using mining equipment that shouldn't have existed. The crystal forests had been turned into a network of biological warfare dispensers that would release toxins specifically engineered to target Drakhtari physiology. Even the planet's magnetic field had been weaponized, turned into a kind of electromagnetic net designed to disable enemy navigation systems. This is beyond anything I've seen in 12 cycles of military observation, Zektar confided to Chief Santos during a break in the briefing. They were standing on an observation platform that looked out over one of the crystal forests. Watching human engineering teams install what appeared to be reality manipulation devices among the singing trees. Santos nodded slowly. War is different when you're fighting for survival instead of objectives. Changes your perspective on acceptable casualties and collateral damage. But this level of preparation, it's as if humans have been planning for this exact scenario for years. The human turned to look at him, and Zektar saw something in her eyes that made his exoskeleton crawl with involuntary fear responses. We have been. Not this specific scenario, but something like it. Humans have been preparing for war with superior opponents since we first picked up rocks and realized they could be thrown. She gestured toward the modified landscape around them. Every human child learns about the Great Filter, the theoretical point where civilizations either transcend their violent origins or destroy themselves. Most species think it's about technology or resources or social development. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. Humans figured out a long time ago that it's about the willingness to become monsters when monsters come for your children. Before Zektar could respond, alarms began blaring across the human positions. The incoming Drakhtari fleet had been detected at the edge of the system, exactly on schedule. But as the tactical displays updated with new information, It became clear that the enemy had learned from their previous encounter. "Jesus Christ," muttered Lieutenant Torres, staring at his sensor readings. "Sir, you need to see this." The main tactical display lit up with contacts representing the approaching Drakhtari armada. But these weren't the same bioships that had been destroyed 3 days earlier. The enemy vessels showed clear signs of adaptation, their organic hulls modified with what appeared to be temporal shielding designed to counter human disruptor weapons. More disturbing still, they seemed to have incorporated Federation technology scavenged from previous battles, creating hybrid vessels that combined biological adaptability with conventional energy systems. "They're learning," Colonel Chen observed, with something that might have been admiration. "Faster than our models predicted." But Zektar's attention was drawn to something else. The sheer size of the approaching fleet. 2,000 vessels was an underestimate. The real number appeared to be closer to 4,000, including bioships the size of moons and what looked like mobile hive cities that probably contained billions of individual Drakhtari organisms. "Colonel," Dr. Yeshvara's mental voice carried overtones of barely controlled panic. "Surely even human military doctrine has provisions for strategic withdrawal when faced with overwhelming odds?" The human's laugh was genuinely amused, which somehow made it even more terrifying. "Doctor, you're still not getting it. We're not defending Zerium Prime because it's strategically important. We're defending it because running away would send the wrong message." "What message?" Colonel Chan's expression grew distant, as if she was remembering something from long ago. "That humans can be intimidated, that we can be made to back down through superior force, that we're rational enough to cut our losses and retreat when faced with impossible odds." She shook her head slowly. "We can't allow that impression to exist." The next 18 hours passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation that felt like the calm before an apocalypse. Human soldiers moved through their duties with mechanical precision, checking equipment, reviewing tactical plans, and making final preparations for what everyone understood would likely be a final battle. But there was something else present that Zektar couldn't quite identify, an undercurrent of emotion that seemed to permeate every human interaction. It took him several hours to realize what he was witnessing: anticipation. The humans weren't just preparing for battle, they were looking forward to it. Not with the bloodthirsty enthusiasm of berserkers or the grim determination of professional soldiers, but with something approaching religious fervor. They talked about the approaching Drakhtari fleet the way other species might discuss a long-awaited religious ceremony or cultural celebration. "It's about vindication," explained Sergeant Martinez, a human demolitions expert who had been assigned to show the Federation observers the defensive preparations. They were standing in what had once been a crystal grove but was now a maze of interconnected bunkers and weapon emplacements. Every human grows up knowing that we're the monsters in our own stories, the violent species, the ones who solved every problem with bigger sticks and sharper rocks. He gestured toward the defensive positions around them, where human soldiers were making final checks on weapons that seemed to violate the fundamental laws of physics. But when actual monsters show up, when something threatens innocent people who can't defend themselves, Martinez shrugged. Well, suddenly being the violent species doesn't seem like such a bad thing. The human defensive positions were unlike anything Zektar had ever encountered. Rather than creating static fortifications designed to withstand enemy attacks, the humans had built what could only be described as a killing field. Every approach to the planet's major population centers had been turned into a carefully orchestrated death trap, with overlapping fields of fire from weapons that seemed designed to cause maximum psychological trauma rather than simple destruction. The crystal forests themselves had been converted into biological warfare dispensers, but not in the way Zektar had initially understood. The toxins being prepared weren't designed to kill Drakhtari organisms, they were designed to cause them to turn on each other. Psychological warfare agents that would trigger cannibalistic responses, neural disruptors that would make the hive mind communication systems interpret allies as threats, and pheromone scramblers that would cause the bioships to attack their own fleet. The goal isn't to destroy the Drakhtari, Colonel Chen explained during the final strategic briefing. It's to make them destroy themselves while the rest of the galaxy watches. Commander Velnara's mandibles clicked with what Zektar recognized as profound unease. "Colonel, what you're describing sounds like psychological warfare taken to its logical extreme. The long-term effects on Drakhtari society will be exactly what we intend them to be," Chen interrupted. "Complete societal collapse. The destruction of their confidence in their own superiority. The end of their expansion into Federation space." Her smile was purely predatory. "And a demonstration to every other potential threat in the galaxy that humans are not to be trifled with." The first Drakhtari ships entered orbit around Zerion Prime at local dawn on the 7th day. They came in waves, their biomechanical hulls pulsing with organic rhythms as they descended through the planet's atmosphere. The sight was simultaneously beautiful and horrifying. Living starships the size of cities, their hulls covered in sensory organs and feeding tentacles, moving with the fluid grace of creatures born in the void. From his position in the human command bunker, Zektar watched the tactical displays as the enemy fleet took up positions around the planet. There were indeed over 4,000 vessels, ranging from small scout ships no larger than fighters to massive hive mothers that looked like they could consume continents. The sheer scale of the approaching force was enough to make even veteran Federation military analysts question their species' survival instincts. The humans, however, seemed almost relaxed. "All positions report ready," announced Lieutenant Torres, her voice carrying the same professional calm she might use to announce the start of a routine training exercise. Colonel Chen studied the tactical situation for several seconds before nodding. "Very well. Activate the resonance network." What happened next would have been impossible for any other species to achieve, because no other species would have been insane enough to attempt it. The modified crystal forests across Xerion Prime began to sing, their harmonics synchronized with the planet's natural frequency to create a resonance pattern that reached into space itself. But this wasn't the gentle music that the native Xerians used for communication. This was a weapon. The song reached the Draktari fleet and began to interact with their biomechanical systems in ways that their organic computers couldn't process. Ships that had survived the void for thousands of years suddenly found their navigation systems reporting impossible readings. Hive minds that had coordinated fleets across entire star systems began receiving contradictory information from their own sensors. And then the humans began broadcasting on every frequency the Draktari used for communication.
Draktari Fleet. This is Colonel Sarah Chen of the Human Expeditionary Force.
You have entered the sovereign space of a Federation member world with the intention of consuming its population. This is unacceptable. Her voice carried across space with perfect clarity, cutting through the electromagnetic interference caused by the resonance network. We are giving you one opportunity to withdraw from this system and return to your own space. If you choose to remain, we will demonstrate why the Federation requested human intervention. There was a pause, filled only by the haunting harmonics of the weaponized crystal forests. "We are humans, and we have made a decision about you." The response came from the largest hive mother, a creature vessel the size of a small moon, whose surface writhed with billions of individual Draktari organisms.
When it spoke, its voice seemed to emerge from every communication device in the system simultaneously.
"Human Colonel Chen, this is Hive Emperor Keth Vraxi of the Consumption Eternal. Your species has demonstrated admirable ferocity, but you face odds that make victory impossible. We offer terms. Surrender the planet's population for consumption, and we will allow your fleet to withdraw with minimal losses." Colonel Chen was quiet for a long moment, and Zektar realized that everyone in the command bunker was holding their breath. When she finally responded, her voice carried a weight that seemed to press against reality itself. "Hive Emperor, let me explain something to you about humans. We have a saying, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." She paused. "You are evil. We are not good men." "Your meaning is unclear." Chen's smile was visible in her voice. "We're monsters, Hive Emperor, but we're monsters who have chosen a side." Another pause. "And you just gave us permission to stop pretending otherwise." The signal cut out, and Colonel Chen turned to address her command staff. "All units, weapons free. Rules of engagement are simple. Kill everything that isn't us. No survivors, no prisoners, no mercy." She looked directly at Zektar and the other Federation observers. "Time to find out what humans are really capable of when we stop holding back." The galaxy had never witnessed anything like what happened in the skies above Xerion Prime that day. Zektar had observed dozens of major space battles throughout his career as a military scholar. He had studied the methodical precision of Krathan fleet actions, the elegant coordination of Zephyrian mind-linked squadrons, and the overwhelming firepower of Federation dreadnought formations. Each species had developed their own approach to warfare based on their natural advantages: superior technology, enhanced reflexes, hive mind coordination, or simple numerical superiority. The humans fought like the universe owed them money. The first indication that this battle would be different from anything previously recorded came when the human defense platforms activated. These weren't the conventional orbital weapons that most civilized species used. massive railguns or energy projectors designed to engage enemy fleets at maximum range. Instead, the humans had constructed what could only be described as reality manipulation devices disguised as defensive systems. The nearest Drakhtari hive mother, a creature vessel called the Eternal Hunger, that measured nearly 50 kilometers from mandible to feeding tail, suddenly found itself experiencing localized gravitational anomalies. Space-time began warping around the bioship in patterns that made its organic navigation systems report impossible readings. Up became down, forward became backward, and the fundamental constants of physics seemed to shift without warning. But the truly horrifying part wasn't the technology, it was the precision with which it was applied. Gravitational disorientation field is holding steady, reported Lieutenant Torres, monitoring the tactical situation from the command bunker deep beneath Zerion Prime's surface. Target vessel is experiencing approximately 17 distinct spatial distortions simultaneously. Colonel Chen nodded approvingly. And the crew? Bioscans indicate severe neural disruption throughout the ship. The hive mind appears to be fragmenting, as individual Drakhtari begin to question their sensory input. Torres paused, checking her readings again. Sir, they're starting to attack each other. On the main tactical display, the Eternal Hunger was indeed consuming itself from the inside out. Thousands of Drakhtari organisms confused by the conflicting sensory data caused by the gravitational distortions had begun to perceive their own hive mates as invading parasites. What had once been a unified biological entity was rapidly becoming a floating charnel house as the creatures tore each other apart in an orgy of misdirected violence. Estimated time to complete internal breakdown? Chen asked. 14 minutes, sir. Maybe less if the panic spreads to the other bioships. Zektar felt his exoskeleton crawling with involuntary horror responses. In all his years of studying military tactics, he had never encountered anything quite like this. The humans weren't just fighting their enemies. They were turning the Drakhtari into weapons against themselves. This is psychological warfare taken to its absolute extreme, whispered Dr. Yeshvara, her gossamer form flickering with distress. The long-term psychological impact on Drakhtari society will be catastrophic. Chief Santos, who was standing nearby monitoring communication intercepts, turned to look at the Zephyrian doctor. That's the point, ma'am. We want every Drakhtari in the galaxy to know exactly what happens when you threaten human-protected worlds. But the gravitational weapons were only the beginning. As more Drakhtari vessels descended through Zerion Prime's atmosphere, they encountered the modified crystal forests that had been turned into biological warfare dispensers. The trees sang their weaponized harmonics while simultaneously releasing clouds of engineered pathogens into the air, not designed to kill, but to fundamentally alter Drakhtari physiology in real time. The first bioships to enter the planetary atmosphere began changing almost immediately. Their organic hulls started producing new kinds of tissue, their weapon systems began firing on random targets, and their crews found their hive mind communication networks flooded with sensory data that made no logical sense. Within minutes, entire formations of Drakhtari vessels were engaging each other in aerial combat, convinced that they were fighting human infiltrators rather than their own allies. Jesus Christ, muttered Sergeant Martinez, watching the feeds from the surface battle. It's like watching a nightmare eat itself. The human ground forces weren't even engaging the enemy directly. They simply maintained their positions in the modified crystal forests, occasionally redirecting the biological warfare streams to ensure maximum psychological impact on the descending Drakhtari. The aliens were doing all the actual fighting, turned into unwitting weapons against their own fleet, through a combination of neurological disruption and carefully engineered paranoia. But the most disturbing aspect of the battle was yet to come. As the Drakhtari fleet realized they were being systematically destroyed by their own forces, Hive Emperor Keth Vraxi made a desperate decision. The massive command vessel began broadcasting override signals designed to shut down the compromised bioships, essentially performing euthanasia on thousands of his own vessels to prevent them from continuing to attack the fleet. It was exactly what the humans had been waiting for. Hive Emperor is implementing containment protocols, Torres announced. He's killing his own ships to stop the cascade failure. Colonel Chen smiled with genuine pleasure. Perfect. Activate the mirror protocol. What happened next would be studied by military analysts for generations. The human orbital platform suddenly began broadcasting perfect copies of the Drakhtari override signals, but modified in ways that made them appear to be coming from other parts of the enemy fleet. To the confused and panicking bioships, it looked like their own command structure was simultaneously ordering them to shut down and continue fighting. The Drakhtari hive mind evolved over millions of years to coordinate perfect unity among billions of organisms, simply couldn't process the contradictory information. Individual bioships began making autonomous decisions, something that had never happened in the species' recorded history. Some vessels attempted to withdraw from combat, others turned their weapons on their command ships, and still others simply shut down their life support systems and drifted dead in space. "My God," breathed Commander Velnara, her Krathan pragmatism overwhelmed by what she was witnessing. "They're not just defeating the enemy fleet, they're destroying the fundamental basis of Drakhtari civilization." Zektar found himself unable to speak. In less than 3 hours, he had watched the humans systematically dismantle a fleet that should have been capable of consuming entire star systems. But more than that, they had done it in a way that would make it impossible for the Drakhtari to ever trust their own biological systems again. Even if some of the aliens survived, they would carry the memory of this defeat back to their home territories, spreading the psychological contamination throughout their entire species. The final phase of the battle was almost anticlimactic. With the majority of the Drakhtari fleet either destroyed or disabled, the remaining hive mothers attempted to retreat toward the system's edge, but the humans had anticipated this as well. Long-range interdiction fields activated around the fleeing vessels, trapping them in localized bubbles of altered space-time where escape to hyperspace was impossible. One by one, the massive bioships were hunted down and destroyed by human pursuit squadrons using weapons that seemed to have been designed specifically to maximize terror rather than simple efficiency. Ships that had survived for thousands of years dissolved into component atoms under the influence of null field projectors. Others aged into dust and debris as temporal accelerators compressed centuries of decay into microseconds. A few were simply erased from existence by devices that Zektar suspected violated several fundamental conservation laws. But it was the final communication from Hive Emperor Keth Vraxi that truly demonstrated the scope of human psychological warfare capabilities. The massive command vessel was dying, its biomechanical systems failing as the modified pathogens continued to spread throughout its organic components. Thousands of individual Drakhtari were still tearing each other apart in the corridors, convinced that they were fighting human boarding parties rather than their own species. The hive mind that had once coordinated fleets across multiple star systems was fragmenting into billions of individual consciousnesses, each one experiencing the unique horror of true isolation for the first time in their evolutionary history. Human Colonel Chen. The Hive Emperor's voice was barely recognizable, distorted by the neurological damage caused by the biological weapons. "What have you done to us?" Colonel Chen's response was broadcast on every frequency, ensuring that any surviving Drakhtari vessels would carry the message back to their home territories. "We have shown you what humans are capable of when you threaten something we have chosen to protect," she said simply. "Your species evolved to consume other life forms. Our species evolved to survive consumption attempts." There was a pause filled only by the death screams of a dying hive mother. "You wanted to know what made humans different from other Federation species? The answer is simple. We don't just fight our enemies. We make them into object lessons for anyone else who might be considering similar actions." The transmission from the Hive Emperor cut to static, and the last Drakhtari command vessel dissolved into its component molecules under the influence of weapons that reduced matter to pure energy. In the aftermath, as human recovery teams began searching for survivors among the wreckage of the alien fleet, Zektar found himself in the medical bay of the command facility. He wasn't injured, at least not physically, but the ship's medical officer, Dr. Patel, had insisted on examining all Federation observers for signs of psychological trauma. "It's not uncommon," she explained while running some kind of neural scan on his compound eyes. "Witnessing large-scale human military operations can be intense for other species. We've learned to monitor for signs of existential crisis, species identity disorders, and what we call predator recognition syndrome." "Predator recognition syndrome?" Dr. Patel nodded, making notes on her medical pad. "It's what happens when a prey species suddenly realizes they've been living next to apex predators without knowing it. Can cause everything from generalized anxiety to complete psychological breakdown, depending on the individual's stress tolerance." Zektar considered this for several seconds. "Doctor, are humans aware of the psychological impact their military capabilities have on other species?"
"Of course. It's intentional."
She looked up from her scanner, and Zektar saw the same predatory intelligence he had grown to associate with human expressions. "The goal isn't just to win battles. It's to make potential enemies reconsider whether they really want to fight us in the first place. By demonstrating overwhelming technological superiority, Dr. Rare, Patel shook her head. Technology can be copied or countered. What we demonstrate is something much more fundamental, that humans are willing to become monsters when monsters threaten what we care about. That's not something that can be replicated by other species. She finished her scans and made a final note on her medical pad. You're showing some signs of stress, but nothing that won't resolve with time. I'd recommend avoiding combat zones for the next few cycles while your neural pathways readjust to baseline threat assessment parameters. As Zektar left the medical bay, he encountered Chief Santos in the corridor outside. The veteran human was leaning against a bulkhead, staring at a data pad that showed casualty reports from the recent battle. How many? Zektar asked quietly. Human casualties, 17 wounded, mostly from equipment malfunctions. No deaths. Santos looked up from her pad. Draktari casualties are harder to calculate. The bioships made it difficult to get accurate organism counts, but current estimates put it somewhere around 40 billion individual aliens. The number was staggering. 40 billion lives ended in less than 6 hours, and the humans had accomplished it while suffering fewer casualties than might be expected from a routine training exercise. Does it bother you? Zektar asked. The scale of destruction? Santos was quiet for a long moment, her expression distant. You want to know the truth? It bothers me that it was necessary. It bothers me that there are species in this galaxy that look at peaceful worlds full of innocent people and see nothing but food. She gestured toward a nearby porthole that showed the debris field left by the destroyed Draktari fleet. But the actual killing, no, that doesn't bother me. The Draktari made their choice when they decided to consume sentient beings. We just helped them live with the consequences. She pushed away from the bulkhead and began walking toward the command center. The thing about humans, Zektar, is that we understand the difference between justice and revenge. What we did here today was justice. What we'll do to the next species that threatens Federation worlds. She smiled, and Zektar felt his prey instincts scream warnings. That'll be revenge. And trust me, you don't want to see what humans are capable of when we're not interested in being fair. 6 months after the Battle of Zirium Prime, Zektar stood before the Combined Military Council of the Galactic Federation, delivering what would become known as the most important military intelligence briefing in galactic history. The council chamber was a massive amphitheater carved from living crystal on the neutral world of consensus, designed to accommodate representatives from over 200 different species. The air hummed with translation fields and the subtle bioluminescence of creatures that communicated through controlled light patterns. It was a place where the greatest minds in the galaxy gathered to discuss matters of war and peace, survival and extinction. Today they were discussing humanity. Honored representatives, Zektar began, his 4 arms gesturing to the holographic displays that showed the complete tactical analysis of the Zirian engagement. I have observed human military operations for the past standard year. What I witnessed challenges every assumption we have made about warfare, civilization, and the nature of intelligent species. The murmur that rippled through the chamber carried undertones of fear, curiosity, and barely controlled panic in a dozen different languages. Everyone present had seen the preliminary reports. A single Draktari fleet had been completely annihilated by human forces without significant casualties. But the tactical details had been classified at the highest levels, known only to the military observers who had witnessed the battle firsthand. Ambassador Kretak, a massive Krathak, whose chitinous armor bore the scars of 70 years of diplomatic service, rose from his section of the amphitheater. Observer Zektar, we have read your preliminary reports. The humans demonstrated impressive tactical capabilities and advanced weaponry. However, we fail to see why this requires a full council session rather than standard military briefings. Zektar's throat pouch contracted with what might have been bitter amusement. Ambassador, with respect, you have not read my complete report. The weapons and tactics were not the most significant aspects of human military capability. He activated a new set of holographic displays, showing detailed recordings from the battle. The images were difficult to watch. Draktari bioships consuming themselves from the inside out, massive hive mothers dissolving into component atoms, and perhaps most disturbing of all, the complete psychological breakdown of a species that had terrorized the galaxy for over a standard year. The humans did not simply defeat the Draktari, Zektar continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. They systematically dismantled the enemy's ability to function as a unified species. The biological warfare agents they employed were not designed to kill. They were designed to make the Draktari incapable of trusting their own sensory systems, their own biology, their own collective consciousness. Doctor, Whisper of Dreams, the Zephyrian xenopsychologist, flowed forward slightly. Her mental voice reached every representative simultaneously, carrying overtones of deep concern. Observer Zektar, you are describing warfare that targets the fundamental psychological basis of an enemy species. Such tactics border on genocide. No, Doctor, Zektar replied quietly. They crossed that border, and the humans are fully aware of this fact. The chamber fell silent except for the ambient hum of life support systems and translation fields. Representatives who had been engaging in quiet side conversations suddenly focused their attention on the Valorian warrior scholar standing at the center of the amphitheater. Zektar activated another set of recordings, these showing the final communication between Colonel Chen and Hive Emperor Kef. Varaxi. The audio quality was perfect, capturing every nuance of the human officer's voice as she explained exactly what humanity had done and why. The humans call it sending a message, Zektar explained as the recording played. They deliberately chose methods of warfare that would maximize psychological trauma rather than simple military effectiveness. Every weapon system, every tactical decision, every psychological warfare protocol was designed to ensure that any surviving Draktari would carry the memory of their defeat back to their home territories. Admiral Vexandra of the Hegemony Defense Fleet, a scarred veteran of the Third Expansion Wars whose species was known for their tactical brilliance, stood to address the chamber. Observer, you speak as if this is somehow unique. Psychological warfare has been employed by every major military force in galactic history. The goal of warfare is always to break the enemy's will to fight. Admiral, you are correct that psychological warfare is not unique, Zektar acknowledged. What is unique is the scale and precision with which humans employ it, and their apparent willingness to accept the moral consequences of their actions. He gestured toward new displays showing intelligence reports gathered in the months following the battle. The data painted a picture of systematic collapse throughout Draktari space. Hive fleets that had operated as unified entities for thousands of years were fragmenting into individual vessels as trust in collective decision-making broke down. In-consum raids had virtually ceased as Draktari commanders became paralyzed by uncertainty about their own sensory input. Several entire sectors of their territory had fallen into civil war as different hive mothers began attacking each other. Convinced that their rivals had been compromised by human infiltration, the Draktari hegemony is effectively extinct as a unified political entity, Zektar reported. Not because the humans destroyed their fleet, though they did, but because they destroyed the Draktari ability to function as a hive mind species. Individual aliens survive, but their civilization has collapsed. The implications of this statement began to sink in across the chamber. Representatives looked at each other with expressions that ranged from awe to horror, depending on their species' cultural attitudes toward violence and the nature of warfare. Senator Val Koresh of the Peaceful Coalition rose from the diplomatic section. His species, the Ethmori, were known throughout the galaxy for their commitment to non-violent resolution of conflicts. Observer Zektar, you are describing actions that violate the fundamental principles of civilized warfare. The systematic destruction of an enemy's cultural and biological identity is precisely what the Galactic Conventions were designed to prevent. Senator, you are absolutely correct, Zektar replied. Which brings us to the most important aspect of human military capability. They are not signatories to the Galactic Conventions. The chamber erupted in voices speaking 100 different languages, translation fields struggling to keep up with the sudden flood of commentary and questions. Some representatives were demanding immediate action to bring human military activities under Federation oversight. Others were arguing for increased cooperation with a species that had demonstrated the ability to completely eliminate existential threats to Federation worlds. Ambassador Kretak raised himself to his full height, his massive frame commanding attention through sheer physical presence. Observer Zektar, are you suggesting that humanity represents a threat to Federation security? The question hung in the air like a physical weight. Zektar looked around the chamber, studying the faces and forms of beings who represented the most advanced civilizations in known space. He thought about the human soldiers he had observed, their casual efficiency in the face of overwhelming odds, and the cold calculation behind their tactical decisions. Ambassador, he said finally, I am suggesting that humanity represents the most significant military force in galactic history, and we have a choice to make about our relationship with them. He activated a final set of displays showing human fleet movements in the months following the Zarian battle. Instead of consolidating their forces or establishing permanent bases in Federation space, the humans had dispersed their military assets and returned most of their personnel to Earth. It was the behavior of a species that had accomplished its objectives and was returning to peacetime activities. The humans are not conquerors, Zektar explained. They have no interest in territorial expansion or political domination. What they have is a very simple philosophy about the use of military force. If something threatens people they have chosen to protect, they will destroy it completely and permanently, regardless of the cost to themselves or the moral implications of their methods. Doctor, Whisper of Dreams flowed forward again, her mental voice carrying overtones of deep concern. Observer, you speak as if this is somehow reassuring. A species that is willing to commit genocide to protect allies is hardly less dangerous than a species that commits genocide for conquest. Doctor, you are missing the critical distinction, Zektar replied. Conquerors eventually run out of things to conquer. Protectors never run out of things to protect. The debate that followed lasted for 3 days and covered every aspect of human military capability, political philosophy, and cultural psychology. Representatives argued about the moral implications of allying with a species that was apparently willing to commit systematic genocide in the name of defense. Military analysts debated the strategic advantages of having human forces available to counter existential threats. Political theorists worried about the long-term consequences of legitimizing human methods of warfare. In the end, the vote was closer than many had expected, but decisive nonetheless. The Galactic Federation formally recognized humanity as a Category 7 Protective Alliance partner, a classification that had never been used before and would never be used again. The designation came with unique privileges and responsibilities. Humans would be granted complete autonomy over their military operations and would not be bound by Federation conventions regarding acceptable methods of warfare. In exchange, they would serve as the Federation's primary response force for existential threats to member worlds. As Zektar prepared to return to his homeworld, he found himself in the observation lounge of the transport ship, staring out at the stars and thinking about the implications of what had been decided. The galaxy had fundamentally changed in the space of a single battle, though most beings didn't yet understand how. Chief Santos, who had been assigned as the human liaison to the Federation Military Command, joined him at the viewport. She carried herself with the same casual confidence he had observed throughout their time together, but there was something different in her eyes now, a weight that hadn't been there before. Congratulations, Zektar said quietly. Your species has achieved something unprecedented. Formal recognition as the galaxy's ultimate military authority while maintaining complete independence from political oversight. Santos nodded slowly. It's not exactly what we wanted, but it's what the situation required. She gestured toward the stars visible through the viewport. The thing about being the monster in the room is that everyone assumes you want to eat them. It takes time to convince them that you're only interested in eating the other monsters. And if there are no other monsters? The human smile was genuinely amused. Then we go back to being human. We build things, explore places, create art, fall in love, and try to make the galaxy a slightly better place than we found it. She paused. Until something threatens what we care about. Then we become monsters again. Zektar was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications of that statement. The Federation representatives are afraid of you, he said finally. Not just your military capabilities, but what you represent. The idea that civilized behavior is a choice rather than an evolutionary inevitability. They should be afraid, Santos replied matter-of-factly. Not of us specifically, but of what happens when civilized societies stop being willing to defend civilization itself. Over the following months, Zektar watched as news of the human victory spread throughout the galaxy. The reaction was unlike anything he had ever observed in his years as a military scholar. Some species, particularly those that had suffered under Drakhtari raids, celebrated the complete elimination of the threat. Others, especially those with strong pacifist traditions, expressed horror at the methods humans had employed to achieve victory. But the most significant reaction came from the galaxy's other predator species. The Kethmoran Empire, which had been expanding aggressively into Federation space for the past decade, suddenly announced a unilateral ceasefire and withdrew their fleets to defensive positions around their core worlds. The Vasti Collective, notorious for their slave raids on primitive worlds, began releasing captive populations and offering reparations to affected species. Even the Crimson Horde, a nomadic confederation of warrior clans that had terrorized shipping lanes for generations, petitioned for formal peace treaties with the Federation. The message had been received and understood. The galaxy now contained a species that was willing and capable of completely eliminating threats to innocent populations, regardless of the moral cost to themselves. It's working exactly as intended, Colonel Chen explained during a briefing at Federation Military Command 6 months after the battle. She was addressing a room full of military analysts and intelligence officers, many of whom were still struggling to understand the implications of human strategic doctrine. The goal was never just to defeat the Drakhtari, she continued, activating displays that showed the dramatic reduction in hostile activities throughout Federation space. The goal was to establish a new paradigm for dealing with existential threats. We wanted every potential aggressor in the galaxy to understand that attacking Federation worlds would result in consequences far beyond simple military defeat. Admiral Vexandra, who had become something of an expert on human military psychology, leaned forward in her chair. Colonel, your methods have been undeniably effective. But the long-term implications of psychological warfare on this scale, she gestured toward intelligence reports showing the ongoing collapse of Drakhtari civilization. How does humanity justify the complete destruction of an entire species' cultural identity? Chen's expression didn't change, but Zakhtar noticed the subtle shift in her posture that he had learned to associate with dangerous human emotions. Admiral, the Drakhtari consumed 3 billion sentient beings before we intervened. They turned children into food and families into resources. Their cultural identity was built on the systematic consumption of other intelligent species. She activated new displays showing archived footage from Drakhtari raids on civilian populations. The images were difficult to watch. Families torn apart as parents were consumed while their children watched entire cities stripped of biological matter, and worst of all, the careful farming operations the Drakhtari had established to breed intelligent species for food production. We didn't destroy their cultural identity, Chen said quietly. We simply made it impossible for them to continue expressing it through genocide. The room fell silent as the implications of that statement sank in. The humans hadn't just defeated an enemy. They had made a moral judgment about the fundamental nature of Drakhtari civilization and acted to eliminate it permanently. Dr. Zin Teta, a respected Xenop psychologist whose species was known for their analytical approach to ethical questions, raised a tentacle to request attention. Colonel, you speak as if humanity has appointed itself as the moral arbiter of galactic civilization. What gives your species the authority to make such judgments? Chen's smile was sharp enough to cut vacuum. Doctor, we didn't appoint ourselves to anything. The Federation asked for our help when their conventional military forces proved inadequate against the Drakhtari threat. She gestured towards the tactical displays showing the complete destruction of the enemy fleet. We simply provided the help that was requested, using methods that ensured the problem would not recur. But surely there were alternative approaches. There were, Chen interrupted. The Federation tried them for over a year while the Drakhtari consumed entire populations. Diplomatic initiatives, economic sanctions, limited military interventions, negotiated truces, every civilized approach to conflict resolution that has ever been developed. Her voice carried a weight that seemed to press against the consciousness of everyone in the room. They all failed, Doctor. And while they were failing, innocent beings died by the billions. She stood and walked to the holographic display showing the current tactical situation throughout Federation space. For the first time in over a century, the galaxy was experiencing something approaching genuine peace. Territorial disputes were being resolved through negotiation rather than warfare. Piracy had declined to historic lows as criminal organizations decided that potential profits weren't worth risking human attention. Even species with millennia-old grudges were finding ways to coexist rather than continuing cycles of revenge and retribution. Humans understand something that most galactic civilizations seem to have forgotten, Chen continued. Peace is not the natural state of the universe. Peace is something that has to be actively maintained through the credible threat of overwhelming violence against those who would disturb it. She turned to face the assembled officers and analysts. We are willing to be the monsters in your nightmares so that your children don't have to be. We will carry the moral weight of necessary violence so that civilized societies can continue to exist without compromising their principles. Her expression softened slightly. But understand that this is a choice we make, not an obligation we have accepted. And it is a choice we can unmake if we decide that the galaxy is not worth protecting. The briefing concluded with detailed discussions of human military doctrine, strategic objectives, and integration protocols with existing Federation defense forces. But Zektar found his attention drawn to a single phrase that Chen had used. We can unmake if we decide that the galaxy is not worth protecting. It was a reminder that humanity's protection of Federation worlds was not guaranteed by treaty or obligation, but by their ongoing decision to care about the fate of other species, and like all choices, it could be changed. As Zektar prepared his final report on human military capabilities, he found himself struggling with how to adequately convey the true nature of what he had observed. The weapons and tactics were impressive, certainly, but they could be studied, analyzed, and eventually countered by sufficiently advanced civilizations. The psychological warfare techniques were devastating in their effectiveness, but they relied on specific vulnerabilities that might not exist in all potential enemies. What made humans truly terrifying was something far more fundamental: their apparent willingness to sacrifice their own moral certainty in service of protecting others. Every other species Zektar had studied maintained some form of ethical constraints on their behavior in warfare. They had lines they would not cross, methods they would not employ, costs they were not willing to pay. These constraints were often seen as signs of civilized behavior, evidence of moral evolution beyond the brutal necessities of survival. Humans had evolved beyond those constraints entirely. They understood the moral cost of their actions and chose to pay it anyway. They knew that their methods made them monsters by any reasonable definition, and they accepted that burden as the price of protecting innocent lives. They had weaponized their own capacity for evil in service of good, creating a form of warfare that was simultaneously more moral and more immoral than anything the galaxy had previously witnessed. In his final report to the Valorian High Command, Zektar wrote, "Humanity represents a fundamental discontinuity in galactic military evolution. They are not simply another aggressive species with advanced technology, nor are they traditional conquerors seeking territorial expansion. They are, in the most literal sense, professional monsters who have chosen to use their monstrous capabilities in defense of those who cannot defend themselves. This makes them simultaneously the most valuable allies and the most dangerous enemies any civilization could possess. Their protection is absolute and their methods are unlimited, but their allegiance is entirely dependent on their perception of moral necessity. The Federation has gained a guardian that is capable of eliminating any conceivable threat to civilian populations, but we have also accepted responsibility for ensuring that we remain worthy of that protection. If humanity ever decides that Federation civilization has become corrupt, decadent, or simply not worth preserving, we will face the same fate as the Drakhtari. I recommend that all Valorian military academies begin including mandatory courses on human psychology, strategic doctrine, and moral philosophy, not because we need to understand their methods, but because we need to understand what they expect from us in return for their protection. We are no longer the apex predators of our own defense. We are livestock under the protection of shepherds who are far more dangerous than any wolves. Our survival depends on ensuring that we never give those shepherds reason to reconsider their role." The report was classified at the highest levels and distributed only to military commanders and political leaders across Federation space, but its conclusions spread through informal channels, whispered conversations between diplomats and quiet briefings in secure facilities. The galaxy had changed, and everyone knew it. Humanity had shown them all what true monsters looked like when they chose to fight for good instead of evil. And perhaps more importantly, they had demonstrated that the thin line between civilization and barbarism wasn't as permanent as most species had believed. In the end, the most terrifying thing about humans wasn't their weapons, their tactics, or even their willingness to commit genocide in defense of others. It was the knowledge that every other species in the galaxy possessed the same capacity for monstrous behavior, hidden beneath layers of civilization and moral constraints. The humans had simply chosen to embrace what they really were, and in doing so, they had become the guardians of a galaxy that finally understood the true cost of peace.